Action!
Hi, this is Nate Schulte with another episode of Discovering Battles with Nate. Well, for this episode, we are going to be talking about only one day of a major battle that took place in the American Civil War. The date was July 3rd, 1863, and this was a battle of Gettysburg. Now, this battle was pretty much was a major battle because this was a morale booster for the Union Army. Robert E. Lee had pretty much been winning many battles, with the exception of Antietam, which took place the previous year of 1862. And so he was back trying to lure the Union forces away from Washington, D.C. Now, he pretty much had been trying to defeat the Union Army after he drove them out of the town, but around Cemetery Hill, that's where the Union decided to toe the line. But we will talk about that in other episodes. But the one thing I will mention before we get down to the lesson of this episode, Culp's Hill and Little Round Top were pretty much the previous day's attempts for Lee to wipe out the Union Army and get around the Union lines and be able to capture General Meade's headquarters. General George Meade was the Union commander after McClellan was fired by Lincoln. And Meade was pretty much a defensive general. Now, the major part of the Battle of Gettysburg Day 3 was the infamous Pickett's Charge. General George E. Pickett was a graduate of West Point in 1846, and he graduated dead last in his class. But he became a colonel of the Confederate Army in July of 1861. The following year, he made it to general. Although his brigade was not the only brigade that was involved in Pickett's charge, there was also the brigades of Kemper, Garnett, and Armstead. And Longstreet was actually the one to organize the whole charge. And the charge consisted of 15,000 men. Now, Pickett's men had not fought at all during the Battle of Gettysburg. They were pretty much the freshest troops there, and pretty much the whole Confederate Army was worn out. And they knew that the Union Army was pretty worn out too. Now, the thing to remember is that after the failed attempts of Culp's Hill and Little Round Top, they were replaced by fresh troops who were full strength to be able to defend these areas in case Lee tried again. But we'll get to that in other episodes. What happened was Pickett's men had to charge across 1 whole mile of open field. That's 1 mile. Now, in an open field, there are no rocks, no trees for cover. You're pretty much a sitting duck. If cannons are used upon your enemy and you're charging at them, that's pretty much suicide right there. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 3 o'clock, the Confederates had 150 cannons firing upon the Union Army. It was to try to keep them down, to keep their heads down, and also hopefully they would be down long enough for the charge to actually make it all the way to the Union and wipe out the Union front line. But as soon as 3 o'clock rolled around and the guns for the Confederate Army were silent, that's when Pickett and his men decided to charge. Now bear in mind, the Union Army has 80 guns and they fired upon the charge with canisters and cannonballs, which was a tactic that was well thought of. What happened was they didn't fire upon the Confederate artillery because they knew that the Confederates had something up their sleeve. And Lee was going to get ready for a final blow. But something I'd like to mention that I heard from a Civil War reenactor somewhere. He told me that this day was also something that George Armstrong Custer, the famous 5th Michigan cavalry commander who would later go on to the Battle of the Little Bighorn and lead the 7th Cavalry Division against the Lakota Sioux, but we'll talk about him later. But he prevented a cavalry charge of the Confederates from actually trying to capture General Meade's headquarters while Pickett's charge was going on. Now, the thing to remember is that the Union artillery units were firing upon the Confederates, and while they were charging over the open field, men were getting pretty much knocked out all over the place. And by the time, though there was very few survivors that made it to the brick wall and everything, there was barely 100 Confederates that made it. Barely 100. And as soon as they got to the wall, not only did they have musket fire to worry about, but the ones who got close enough, they were at the Union soldiers in close combat. That means muskets were used for clubs, musket butts were used, bayonets, pretty much everything. There was barely any survivors left. And the few that did survive, some that made it all the way back to General Lee, told him that the whole division was a failure, and Lee was haunted by this for the rest of his life. And he decided to order his men to retreat and live to fight another day. Now, for the whole casualties of the battle, the whole battle itself, for the Union, there was a total of 23,055 casualties. And for the Confederates, there was 23,231. A grand total of 46,286 combined, both sides. And there was one female civilian who was killed. Her name was Jenny Wade. For those of you who are fans of the show Ghost Adventures, they actually went to the house in Gettysburg where Jenny Wade was staying, where she was shot and where she died. But I just thought I'd mention that. But that's pretty much it for this episode, for this battle. However, my sources are pretty much Gettysburg, The Battle for Liberty and Equality and Brotherhood by Nigel Cawthorne, Civil War Day by Day, and Commanders and Heroes of the American Civil War by Jonathan Sutherland. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Discovering Battles with Nate. And until next time, be safe, stay healthy, and thank you for watching. Please subscribe, and also leave me any questions in the comments section you might have about this or any other battles that I have talked about. Thank you very much. Good night.